My goal here is to try to move through these slides, and Mike will make these available after the fact. You can pull down the full report if you would, and it's free if you print it as a PDF. The genesis of this report and the authority is pretty simple. The Federal Facilities Council, which is made up of the federal departments and agencies working under the umbrella of the Board of Infrastructure and the Constructed Environment, felt that there was a need to take a look at the subject of renewal. It's been thrown around a little bit, particularly, frankly, I know of it from the word urban renewal. And what we ended up strapping in was a discussion about what is it that they mean by the word renewal, and they've come up with that answer on the next slide. But we were given a statement of task, and the statement of task was to identify strategies for the effective renewal of federal facilities. Next slide, if I could. This is as background as part of a larger set of studies that occurred in the 1990s. I said the 1980s, but 1990s forward, with the last one being the 2012 study, which was entitled Predicting the Outcomes. So that's the first 6 studies on the left at the bottom. In 2019, followed by 2 studies in 2023, was the beginning of a series of studies looking beyond the sustainment of real property. And so this report, which was a strategy report, was used in part to implement a study done by one of the federal agencies at what it could use this study to do in renewing their campus in Boulder as well as in Gaithersburg, Maryland. So enough to say that this has been the business of the National Academies for 20 or 30 years, and they're effectively carrying it forward. There's a whole set of studies that we suggested to the National Academies that picks up these strategies and to bring tasks to bear on how you would implement these strategies. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. So next slide, if I could. So probably the biggest challenge, and this was occupied a good share of the year 2019, was what did we mean by renewal? What did the Federal Facilities Council, what did the Board on Infrastructure really mean by this word called renewal? And what was its meaning? And we looked into other studies in the National Academies. There was a series of studies done by the Transportation Board looking at federal highways renewal. Similar issue of what's in federal real property. That's to say, an older and aging superhighway and bridges issue across the nation. And how do you, if you will, not just invest in their maintenance and repair, but invest in their renewal as an asset for the next century. And we came to a conclusion on that subject. But, and that's enough on that slide. We'll move on to the basic realization.
Was that enough on that slide? I could go back.
No, don't. That's fine. We were done. I think it's suffice to say, basically the committee started by looking at the published documents out there, A Circular 11 and 123, as well as several policy memos that OMB has issued in the last number of years, including their most recent one, Memo 22-14, which began to look at capital planning in support of the future workforce. This was in the height of COVID that it was being written, 2022 is a specific, and we had purview of that as we were moving where we wanted to go and how we wanted to shape these documents, because on their own, they don't go far enough. And let's just say right there, we'll give you some reasons why and how in the next couple slides. So we looked at those, we combined them with several GAO reports that we were familiar with, and had not only the OMB as well as the GAO folks talk to us about what their strategies were when they were writing these documents. But of particular interest, of course, was ISO 55000 as from a asset management systems approach, as also, more importantly, from my book, a introduction to risk management and asset management using the principles of ISO 31000. And of course, you can't pick up on the ISO series in asset management without the technical coordinating report 251. Forming that background in 2019, that asset renewal, a idea of asset renewal is one of combining capital planning with sustainment planning. And if I were to leave anything behind with you, that's what's bold about what we're talking about. This isn't about a capital plan. This is not about a sustainment plan, but this is a melding of the planning and programming and thinking into a systems thinking approach that looks at the combination of both day-to-day money, O&M money, as well as capital planning money. And in fact, working a budgeting process that works between those lines. We knew we couldn't, if you will, tear down the budgeting process between capital and operations and maintenance planning, but we think both can be informed by each other. I know I, as a facility engineer over the years, Mike, I'll need you to go back. I know as a facilities engineer in my own planning, the number of times that I invested in some significant sustainment action to only find out that headquarters was going to basically demolish the building and rebuild it. And I had no idea of that as a local planner. And the local planners had no mechanism for communicating to higher headquarters what their strategy was with regards to sustainment funding. And so that, if everything else I say today falls on deaf ears, what we were talking about doing was integrating the planning process between the operations and maintenance and the capital plan. We had 6 chapters, and I'll just take 1 or 2 minutes to talk about each of the chapters. And I'll use the findings here as kind of a way of weaving the story of the chapters. Chapters 2 and chapter 3 kind of fit together. Chapters 2 and 3, primarily written by Jack Dempsey, weaves the stout knowledge of what is in the OMB policies, as well as what is in the GAO reports. And to help us with that, we had Brian Lepore as the chapter author, primarily at chapter 3 with Jack. So chapters 2 and 3 set the foundation of what is the existing policy that the federal government is working on in the area of facility asset management. Chapter 4 brought out a whole idea of let's look at the basis of data to inform the decision-making process, as well as the analytical tools. Chapter 5 introduced a topic, frankly, just scratching the surface. And in my opinion, there's a whole study area that needs to be done in asset planning, risk management, both on the risk side and the vulnerability side. So chapter 5 addresses risk. Chapter 6 is the guts of the report, in my opinion, because it began to make recommendations how A11 and A123 can be wickered with a capital asset planning memo in 22 to bring forward strategies that might improve the linkages of today's money with tomorrow's money. Well, there are 26 findings in the report, and the findings are inherent to the chapters. And I wanted to go through that depth of knowledge on the chapters. Think of this as your speed read through the chapters. The next brings the 5 recommendations together. Mike, next
Thank you
slide.
for the speed read, Mike.
So we had 5 recommendations. The first was implement a federal facility asset management system. We'd stop short of saying implement ISO 55000, but we said based on ISO 55000, giving the OMB and the agencies opportunity to bring their best practices and processes that they already have in place into the concepts of strategic thinking. Once you do that, we've addressed this a couple times in the talk so far. This brings the whole idea of working with the comptroller community on capital planning and ensuring capital planning and asset sustainment planning work together. Frankly, we think the National Strategy for the Efficient Use of Real Property, the 2020 and its predecessor in 2018, are critical memos. We think they need to wrap in this whole idea of asset planning from a capital point of view. There are indeed needs to improve the data models, improve the data, expand the models, and then have the feedback loop on the measures so that the measures in the analysis, the analytics from the data and the models drive improved decision-making. And then finally, implement this into a series of policies. This isn't a vision, this is a set of policies by, frankly, just fine-tuning A11, A123, as well as a series of memos that have been written by OMB on the subject of facility asset management. So next slide, if I could. And if my voice begins to wither on you, Mike, just say speak louder. So the federal agencies have a series of takeaways. They've got to think about this from a strategic planning point of view. They got to think about this as a community planning point. We had one agency who briefed us just as we were going into COVID. In fact, it was one of the last briefings before we kind of shut down the information gathering. And this agency basically said, in order to make the budget meet over the next 50 years, given what we think is going to be the horizon of the budget line for facilities, we first of all need to delete some of the facilities in the asset list. We can't maintain the number of buildings we have with the funds we. Then they started looking at models that predicted outcomes, much like proposed in 2012 study. And they found an eureka moment where they basically said, the strategy they've been using for years of basically, let's find the worst building that we know we need to keep, and let's fix that worst building first. But they basically said, if the building is past some particular point in its depreciation, let's not fix the building. Let's eliminate the building. Let's take the little bit of O&M money we have and spread it over those buildings that don't take as much effort and cost and human capital to make them effective, and make sure that in the process they're renewed, not only to meet the needs that are in the mission set now, but meet the needs of the mission going forward. So their strategy was not worse first, but let's take the most important building to the mission, or if it isn't a building that's focused on the mission, if it's in good enough shape, can it be renewed or torn down and rebuilt, or demolished and find another facility? And this is what the definition of renewal is all about. It's take the best building for the need, or delete it and put a new building in its place to meet the needs of the mission now and in the future. If the federal agencies need to be thinking about this whole concept of asset strategic planning and putting it into a format of facility renewal, not sustainment until the point where you tear it down and rebuild, but that sustainment going into the continuous renewal of the facility. Then the Office of Management and Budget, and frankly, Congress. And when we talked to OMB, they said, you know, you got to really put Congress into this discussion. It's not within the purview of the national academies to make congressional legislative proposals. But certainly, from my point of view, the Office of Management and Budget has the responsibility to put the right kinds of policy and the right kinds of documents incorporating ISO 55000 principles and requirements into that process. And then if we don't have the feedback with the Government Accountability Office to give back critical information about how things are going and how they can be improved incrementally as we move forward, GAO needs to have a good understanding of some of the outcomes of this report so that they can look at these as they make recommendations in the facility asset management portfolio. Next slide. Further takeaways, frankly. Strategies, and that's what we laid out, a set of strategies, a strategy of using the ISO 55000 as a template, a strategy that takes a look at governance documents and updating those government documents, a strategy that relooks at some of our data collection and asset modeling projections, and then finally a set of provisions in the area of capital planning. For example, the ability that possibly a capital asset revolving working fund could be used for facilities management across at least the civil sector. Department of Defense in their own way have that working in their authorities. They exist already. They didn't quite call that, but it can certainly be considered as part of the process. However, they would benefit from having a truly working capital fund. In any event, all those sets of strategies turn into a asset management systems autonomy that ends up finally into a set of documents. And if that doesn't get written into policy, it's not going to happen. Next slide, I think, if you would please. Oh yeah, I'm going to skip over this one because I pretty much said it. There's some I won't say scrap and throw away, but there's some rewrite required of A11, 123, and 126, or 136. So suffice to say, there's an outline for that. So my concluding points, and then hopefully we can go to conversation here. The strategies proposed are the kind of how-to strategies that we think need to be done. Frankly, we think the departments and agencies know what to do. They just, when they get to the budget process, it falls short of implementation. And that's somewhat on the congressional side, that's somewhat on the agency side. That's somewhat about having the comptroller community or the real asset planning process be part of the fiduciary process of the department and agency. This is about creating real property as part of the agency strategic plan. This is about corporate decision making. The agency I mentioned that had this eureka moment and said, wait a minute, we should be stopped doing this worst first policy and taking a look at our whole asset base and ask the question, what is the best next facility we should invest in? And how does that optimize the budget over the 50 years or 30 years in the planning horizon? That's something that can't be done without the comptroller community part of it. And we can't do it without the agency senior leadership absolutely bought into the process. That agency ended up having a letter signed by all of their operating divisions, stating something along the lines of facilities are very important. But then again, the OSD comptroller, in one of his comments to us when he briefed us at the very end, and this was captured in the last chapter when we were talking about some of the senior agency comments, the OSD comptroller at the time basically said, you know, facilities are important to me to a point. And then I have to balance with other requirements. So give me your best shot of where your next best dollar is going to go, because there isn't enough to go across all the needs that are across the Department of Defense. And that's just one agency speaking to us. And that's my concluding thoughts. Mike, I'd like to turn it over and see if we got any conversation out of this.
Yeah, we've got some questions that I'll get to, but before we go to those, thank you for that. And it was a meticulously planned report based in history and with an intention. It's really appreciated and supported by the Asset Leadership Network. So thank you for taking time to give us the Cliff Notes understanding of that very important document.